From Whitehall, London, this is the RUSI Analysis Podcast.
Hello, I'm Jonathan Eyal from here at the Institute, and I'm joined by Professor Anand Menon, the Director of the UK in Changing Europe programme. Anand, the Prime Minister is going to go to Washington at the end of this week. She's going to be the first leader formally meeting with a newly anointed US President. In a way, it's a great victory for Britain, is it not? The fact that Mrs. May is the first leader of a country that is supposedly isolated now with Brexit looming.
Jonathan, first, thank you for inviting me. And yes, the way diplomacy works, being the first to see the US President is a big deal. So in that sense, there's no doubting the fact that this is a victory for Mrs. May.
But what do you think? I mean, one of the arguments that is being touted in Washington is that the US will be the first one to announce the beginning of free trade negotiations with the UK. Does it play well with the British government's agenda and with the discussions with the European Union?
I think it fits very well with our agenda in the sense that Britain is desperate to show that once we leave the European Union, we won't be alone, we'll have trading partners, we'll have people willing to sign trade deals with us. The European Union, I am sure, will continue to warn that we can't do this till we've left, and it is in fact illegal for us to sign trade deals before we leave. So the actual deal itself will have to wait till we're out. But having that kind of reassurance is important. What I would say, though, is having any old sort of trade deal is relatively easy. Two parties can come together and sign a deal that is essentially meaningless, hold it up to the cameras as a success and gain some political capital. Getting a trade deal that leads to real benefits, and in particular that benefits the British economy, is going to be far more tricky because Donald Trump's slogan is America First. And America First applies as much in trade as in anything else, and I'm sure they'll negotiate hard for their interests rather than ours.
Indeed, and it sounds a bit curious that the first foreign policy initiative of Trump, given what he said, is likely to be the beginning of a free trade agreement with Britain. But nevertheless, I mean, the outcome still is that, as the government in London has been saying for a while, they're not bereft of options. Do you think, how would this sort of meeting between May and Trump be seen in the European Union?
Well, I'm sure it'll spark some irritation in the European Union, not least because Donald Trump has gone out of his way to irritate some key European leaders, Angela Merkel foremost amongst them. So I think the sight of Theresa May trying to cosy up to this new administration without coordinating at all with her European partners will be a source of some frustration. That being said, politically at home, it is good for Mrs. May to show that we still have friends, we still have allies, and that we are first in the line to go and see the new president in the United States.
How do you think the Prime Minister can negotiate this very careful balancing act? Because in her speech last week at Lancaster House, she explicitly refuted one of the arguments of Donald Trump, which is that it's in our interest to see the European Union collapse. I mean, she actually explicitly said, no, it's not. It's in our interest to see the European Union thrive. Do you think it's a difficulty for her to balance the two?
It's a difficulty in one particular way, which is that many on the European continent see a condition of helping the European Union survive as being showing that non-membership doesn't work. That is to say, if you want to maintain the cohesion of the EU, if you want to protect it against their own populists who are calling for Frexit or Nexit or whatever, the best way to do that is to show that if you leave, it imposes costs. So actually, in that sense, there's a slight tension. Strengthening the European Union might mean not giving Britain as good a deal as we might otherwise have had.
So do you buy the argument that there is a sort of a consensus in Europe that at the very least, not punish the UK, but at the very least make sure that the deal would be substandard to full membership?
Absolutely. I think that is a consensus, that we have to show that membership is better than non-membership. Above and beyond that, there are more parochial concerns in different member states. In France and the Netherlands, with the elections coming, it is to show the populists on the right that this kind of tactic doesn't work. Across Central and Eastern Europe, they have domestic constituencies that are concerned about the fact that they might not be able to travel here to work. And the notion that a Polish or a Czech or a Hungarian Prime Minister could go in front of their Parliament and say, accept a deal where the British don't have free movement but they get everything else, is frankly fanciful. So there are different kinds of trade-offs in different countries, but they all, as far as I can see, push in the same direction, which is we're not going to be allowed special treatment that gives us bits of the single market whilst letting us get out of other bits. And to be fair, Mrs May has said we'll be out of the market.
Now, since you mentioned the Prime Minister's speech at Lancaster House, Donald Tusk, the President of the Council, greeted the speech by saying at least it brings some clarity. He didn't like what was being said, but at least it brought some clarity. Do you think it brought some clarity to the British position?
To an extent, and I mean that in two ways. Firstly, I think anyone who's been watching this carefully knew from what the Prime Minister has been saying from July that single market membership is impossible. If we want to be outside the jurisdiction of the court, if we want to control migration to this country, that is incompatible with single market membership. The one area of remaining ambiguity for me, and in fact the speech increased rather than decreasing the ambiguity, is what we're going to do about the customs union. It seemed to me that what the Prime Minister was saying was we want to be outside the customs union because we want to be able to conclude free trade deals of our own, but we want tariff-free access to the European market, which implies being inside the customs union. And that is a circle I think it'll be very, very hard to square.
Now, what do you think is the room for manoeuvre of the European Union? I know we're all guessing at this stage, but if you were to map up a deal in, let's say, 2019, what it would look like, do you think?
Well, I'm quite pessimistic on this score because I suspect that leaving aside the trade deal, which is what really matters, it's going to be quite hard to strike an agreement on what we call Article 50 beforehand. Article 50 is about leaving. It's about tying up the loose ends of British membership. And here I think those negotiations themselves could turn acrimonious quite quickly for one simple reason, which is money. The big issue on the table is the EU budget, what we owe it, and then the other member states themselves have got to decide how they make up the shortfall once we're gone. And it seems to me the potential for those discussions to get quite heated quite quickly is very high.
And we're talking about 11.5% of the contributions of the Union. But the 60 billion euro figure that was touted by Mr. Barnier, the head negotiator, I mean, presumably there's just an opening gambit.
Maybe. It might be the result of a calculation. I don't know how Mr. Barnier is operating in these talks. But it certainly is the case that apart from continuing to contribute till we leave, we will have outstanding liabilities because that's the way the EU budget works. We will have things to pay to the regional fund because our regions can keep claiming up to 3 years after we leave. And then we need to make a decision about whether we want to, as the Prime Minister I think hinted at Lancaster House, consider paying for certain programmes that we want to remain part of. So there are different elements of this, and I think the sum is going to be very big, and it doesn't take much as a sum, as you know, for our red tops in this country to start getting a little bit exercised.
So you reckon that the funding question is going to be one of the most toxic ones when it actually comes. Now, can you... I know, again, let's look at it in a different way. In which way do you think this Brexit talk is going to change the United Kingdom? There was a lot of discussion immediately after the referendum that the nation is divided, split right down the middle. There's still some discussion of whether Mrs. May is going to survive within her own party. So this sort of deep divide in Britain, do you think it's possible to heal it while at the same time, contemplate the possibility that we may walk out of the negotiations with no signed deal at all?
I think the splits go deep, and in some cases they reinforce other splits. So in the case between Scotland and England, you have a national divide over which there is now a leave-remain divide superimposed. My experience of talking in front of audiences is that feelings still run very, very high, and there's no real sign of an emergent consensus between leave and remain. How these negotiations go will be absolutely fundamental to our chances of reconciliation. If, as is possible, the talks end up with Theresa May leaving and saying, a plague on all your houses, these negotiations are not going to work, we're leaving, that, it seems to me, will cause problems at home as well and will reinforce the divisions in our society. And bear in mind, those divisions are made all the worse by the sort of unique political situation we find ourselves in, that the Remain camp do not have a credible political voice at national level to put up a fight against this government. The Liberal Democrats are very, very small in Parliament. Labour is divided, ignored, and largely internally contradictory on EU matters. And so it's a weird period both politically and in terms of our relations with the European Union, which makes things more complicated.
Now, the brim owners, the people who refuse to accept it, and indeed some dewy-eyed Europeans in Brussels, have told me on a number of occasions, who knows, perhaps in the end nothing will happen. Perhaps Britain will stay. Now, the Prime Minister has been quite adamant that the result is what it is and that we would leave. Do you see any circumstances by which the UK could have a buyer's remorse before we leave the European Union?
Well, if there's one thing that 2016 told me, it's that I'll never say never ever again. However, there are probably three answers to that. One, there is as yet no real evidence from the polling about buyer's remorse. And I think insofar as that sort of thing emerges, it will emerge if an economic crisis hits us because of Brexit. The thing is, the real economic impact of Brexit, whether positive or negative, won't be felt till we've left, by which point it'll be too late. Second thing I would say about this is that we don't know whether we can change our mind. This is the question of the revocability of Article 50. Even if Theresa May at the 11th hour sees an awful deal on the table and thinks, oh my God, we need to stop this, lawyers are divided about whether or not she actually can, whether one member state can trigger Article 50 and change its mind. We know that all the member states, if they vote unanimously, can stop the process. We don't know if we can simply turn tail and say, actually, we're going to remain in the club. The third thing I would say is, if you buy the theory that one of the reasons we voted to remain was frustration with a political establishment that was seen as unresponsive, to see that same political establishment decide against the outcome of a democratic referendum will, I think, breed political problems in the future and will make populism stronger rather than weaker in the years ahead.
I agree. I think it's a sort of fool's errand. The final question. What do you think people like us can do? I mean, okay, supposedly we can inform the debate. Do you think we can act as a canary in the mine? Do you think this sort of popular revolt that we have seen is intended against us as well, the so-called experts whose opinions no longer count?
My sense during the referendum campaign itself, and we did a lot of events all over the country, was we live in a post-trust society rather than a post-truth one. People were perfectly willing to listen to us. People were perfectly willing to ask questions about what the facts are about our EU membership, but they expressed distrust about what they saw as the establishment. They're sensitive to the messenger. So many people would say, well, the IMF would say that because the head of the IMF is mates with George Osborne. We all know that. They're all part of the same club. So I think it's more subtle than experts not being trusted. I think it's a question of the messenger as much as of the message. And I think for people like us, what is important is to keep looking at the evidence in a calm, non-hysterical way, to not take sides in this debate, because from the perspective of the project I lead, our reputation for impartiality was the basis of the fact that people listen to us, and to keep saying it how we see it. Whatever, this might irritate one side or the other. It's very hard to say something that doesn't irritate someone these days, but we need to call it as we see it, based on the facts and based on the evidence.
Professor Anand, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
For more analysis, publications and research, visit www.rusi.org.